Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Rambles, where on this particular episode, I feel the need to finally get around to talking about Gacha and similar microtransaction subjects that I have dabbled in before, but feel the need to return to. For longtime viewers of this show, you will know, well, for this show and the rest of my content, you'll know about my feelings on Gacha and microtransactions, and as well as the kind of psychological manipulation that goes into a lot of different varied monetization schemes that are used in gaming these days. And it was recently returned to my mind for a couple of reasons, but a major one being the English release of Uma Musume. For the actual people who have listened to this particular show, you'll remember back in, I believe, Rants and Raves number 7, back when this show was called Rants and Raves, I talked about how games in the modern era, this was just about a year ago, and it's developed further since then. Games in the modern era have often been delving more and more into ways to entice people to play their games and entice people to spend money on their games, because it is no longer sufficient in the current state of things to just make a video game and put it out there. I'm being a little facetious there, we'll get back to that. But Gacha is an interesting topic that I am not super well versed on in a first-hand way, nor in a particularly deeply in a historical way. But I do have my takes on it, and well, it's the internet. Hot takes abound, even for the uninformed. My feeling has always been that I think Gacha is fine in theory and microtransactions are fine in theory, but it ultimately comes down to how they're implemented. So if a game, or game, big air quotes, decides that it wants to do some type of monetization based on basically users wanting cosmetics or wanting outfits or whatever, I think that's in theory fine. My problem always comes in when it seems to psychologically exploit the player and misrepresent how likely they are to actually get what they want. If you're simply buying things outright, even if they're very expensive, to my mind unreasonably expensive, I think that can usually at least be excused on some level, because the payer, let's say, from here on out, it's not really about players anymore for the sake of this argument. The payer knows what they're getting. They're saying, I am giving you this amount of money, you in return are giving me a skin, an outfit, a new character, whatever. It's ultimately very clear. And even if I've certainly over time, I think I talked about this with like Dead by Daylight and a few other games as well, I've certainly had my qualms about, like, that's a $40 skin. Why are you paying? Like, somebody put a lot of work into making that skin, but why are you paying the price of a full price game for that skin? That to me seems insane. But hey, ultimately, I'm not here to try and stop anybody from spending their hard-earned money on what makes them happy. And if it makes them $40 worth of happy, that's fine. But this is where we get messy, because when you introduce Gacha, and I should clarify for those who are uninformed, Gacha or Gachapon is terminology that comes out of primarily, it's a Japanese word, and it comes out of these vending machines that still exist quite a lot in Japan, but less so than before, and kind of didn't migrate to the US very much at all. Where it's a capsule machine. You put a coin in and you turn you can see like the random items that you could get out of it, whether it's a little figurine or a trinket or whatever, and you're basically rolling for it, as we call it now. You might get the one you want, or might get one of the other ones in there. And then there was a whole culture around like going through those things, buying a lot of them, buying, one each, and then trading with your friends, that sort of thing. There's nothing inherently problematic about that either. But that has transferred into the digital age and been adopted by so many games as basically a way of denying a payer what they want until they pay up sufficiently. And the problem with that is that some people are just not psychologically sound. And this is not a judgment. This is like a fundamental like brain chemistry thing that people don't control. Some people are not of sound mind when it comes to those things to be able to stop themselves if they don't get what they want. When it's the same kind of psychology that and addiction loops that go into gambling. And this is why, as I've talked about before, this is why all these countries and things got into it with various games developers over the years about, hey, what you're doing sure looks like gambling, and we have rules about who you can market that to, how you can market it, and whether it's like available to minors and things like that. Basically, people who are more psychologically susceptible to being manipulated by it in an uncontrolled way. So my feeling on that has often been that there needs to be a fair payout under a certain amount of time. And unfortunately, that's counter to basically how every developer would like that to work, right? If you want money from your players, you don't want to guarantee them a payout in a reasonable amount of time. So if somebody said, hey, we've got a gacha system in our game, and if you put $10 into it, $10 worth of rolls is guaranteed to get you every roll possible or something like that, right? But that's not how it works. It's always a matter of you know, they've started now to include things like there's required disclosures about drop rates and things like that, and all those things that have come out over the years in the US and elsewhere. Usually it's compliance with the EU, and then they apply it to the US as well, even though there's not legal things around it here. But ultimately, like, I've never seen one that looked like it was implemented ethically to me. The other thing that made me think about this a little bit is there is one game that I play that has a gacha system in it. I don't engage with it at all. I'll just tell you what it is, because I think I've talked about it before. I play Skullgirls Mobile, which is a mobile, well, to call it the mobile version of the fighting game Skullgirls would be a bit of a misleading thing. It's not the same kind of fighting game, but anyway, it has a whole gacha system. I have so many unopened boxes because I just don't give a shit. I should throw in a screenshot if I remember to. But it has a gacha system, and it has for ages. And finally, like a week ago, after I've played it for probably 5 years now, a week ago, they added a pity system. This is a relatively new development in a lot of games, but it has been around in various games for longer, a few games, where basically after a certain amount of rolls, boxes opened, whatever, the game gives you a pity drop and says, here, you're guaranteed either the best drop or the rarest drop or one of the two rarest drops or something like that. In Skullgirls, in the Skullgirls one, it's kind of interesting because they let you actually pick which ones you'd like to prioritize. It's a whole thing. But I'm getting off on a bit of a tangent there. Where was I going with this? The gacha systems are fundamentally about getting you to roll more, right? It's not, if the game developers simply wanted you to have the characters you wanted, to have the outfits you wanted, whatever, they wouldn't do it this way. They'd just say, here's the outfit, it is $1. If you press the $1 button, you get the outfit, right? But it's no, we're going to make you roll over and over and over and over again. If you're the type of person who is addicted enough to keep doing that, who, let's be honest, those are the only people they care about. If you're the type of person who's susceptible to being psychologically manipulated about this kind of thing, you will keep going. You will keep going to the tune of hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And the number of otherwise like reasonable people who I've spoken with who've casually dropped on me like, oh yeah, I just dropped $800 on this game doing pulls or rolls. And I just kind of stare at them with wide eyes like, are you okay? Because ultimately, like, I can't shame that person because I understand from a psychological perspective, that's not something they entirely have control over. The best I can do is, you know, if I think they're actually harming themselves, like financially harming themselves to the point of not being able to afford things that are actually important, that's where I sort of draw the line of like, I might actually have to step in. I've never actually had to do that before. But that's the kind of thing that scares me because there are a lot of people out there. These are the biggest games in the world right now. And the reason why people play them is in no small part because they are very addicting. There's different levels of this kind of addiction. Sometimes it's, you know, to the tune of $50, $100 sometimes it's thousands, sometimes it's to the point of bankruptcy. And those are the really nasty ones. And thankfully that is fairly rare, but it still happens a not insignificant amount. And especially when a lot of the most played and most visible and most advertised games out there have these things integrated into them, that's what scares me. Now, this ties back into other topics I've talked about. I talked about, like I said, Rants and Raves 7. I talked about the sort of specific psychological manipulation that hooks people into it. And in that episode, I alluded to a project I wanted to do, and I've never gotten around to it, and I'm never going to at this point. I've realized when thinking about this episode, I was not going to do it. So I'm going to talk about it anyway. The thing that I alluded to there was I wanted to play Zenless Zone Zero for a week, every day for a week, and see if it was a viable game. Because that episode was about how people get psychologically manipulated by designs and things that are meant to be deliberately alluring. And that was like right after the release of Zenless Zone Zero. So we didn't know, I didn't know when I made that episode just how much more aggressive it would get. Like some of the character trailers and things that have come out after that have been so far over the top by comparison that it's a whole other realm. So I doubled down on pretty much everything I would say in that episode. But Zenless was not the first one. It was just the latest one at the time. And this idea of, I wanted to do this experiment because I wanted to figure out, does the game have good gameplay? Does it have satisfying gameplay that stands on its own? Is it fundamentally a good game by having all of the basic elements of a game, of like gameplay that's satisfying, a narrative that's interesting, characters that are meaningful, and a meaningful reward system, like game reward system that makes you want to keep playing for game reasons? Or, as I sort of speculated a little bit, but I was trying to reserve judgment, is it more about the manipulation? Is it more about the new banner is up and these are the new characters and you think the characters are hot, and so you're going to keep playing because you need to keep grinding because you need to keep getting resources so you can keep rolling so that you can maybe get the character for free. And if you can't get the character for free, then you need to pay into it so that you can get the character that you want, that has been psychologically sold to you already because you find the character attractive, right? And so all these things tie back in together of, are you diluting gaming as an industry and as an art form by filling it with the most popular things being the things that aren't in fact games, or are barely games, are games on the surface, but underneath all that are basically just psychological traps? Is it just, I am horny for character, therefore I will keep paying money to see character, maybe see character? That feeling, those psychological feelings of like possession and need and you know, those monkey brain like type of things are very compelling. And I don't shame anybody who falls for these traps, because they are traps. These companies, and lots of these companies have talked very openly about this. These companies hire psychologists to do studies and to advise directly on the perfect balance of both the balance of attraction and the things that are alluring to their players, as well as pay-ins and payouts for the balance of these payment systems, so that there's sufficient reward to keep a person paying into a game, into a gacha system, whatever, into microtransactions, without them getting so frustrated that they ever want to stop, but also optimizing, big air quotes, maximizing profits out of those stores and out of those payment systems. And so, to come back around to the initial thing that made me think about this episode again, Uma Musume, I heard this was interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, because I didn't realize Uma Musume was going to blow up the way it has. Uma Musume has been around quite a long time, actually, and it just hasn't been translated to English officially until like a month ago, I think, like that. And it blew up like crazy, like even bigger than Zenless did, or any of the other like Hoyo games or those sorts of things. And these are always flavor of the month. Like these types of games, these gacha adjacent games, all come out, like they come out every now and then, and usually they're, there's a bunch of people who play it on release. They play it for a few months, and some people drop it, and then it tapers out, and then it's just sort of. There's always a maintenance schedule for the developers, like how much more do we have to add to this every so much amount of time to keep our existing player base playing, but we'll just let these peter out, because they always peter out. And there's enough history of these games now that you can see how they play out in their player bases and in their profitability. Genshin is one of the biggest ones that exploded sort of like 5 years ago, and that one has had a really explicit, visible arc for its player base, that sort of thing. So back to Uma Musume. Uma, I didn't expect to explode the way it did, and also has some really interesting, unique elements to it that I think are worth talking about, both positive and negative here. One is that Uma Musume does not allow lewd art to be made of its characters under the player agreement. Now, is that going to stop people? No. But it does tamp down on it a bit. And the reason for this is interesting, because Uma Musume, the IP, the characters are based on real racehorses owned or previously owned by real people in the Japanese horse racing. That's the phrase I was looking for. Horse racing scene. And so having real people, or real the horses themselves are not people, but the people who own the horses, there's a whole personification thing that already goes into something like horse racing, and so turning them into anime girls is kind of a logical step, especially for Japan. And when they're based on real world things, that gets into a lot of IP and rights considerations that are especially weird and unique in Japan. Japan has some very different rules about IP licensing and use. They don't have fair use law, that sort of thing. Those rules are all different. And so, as part of an agreement with the horse owners and those sorts of things, they don't allow looting their characters. Like I said, that's not going to stop people, but that doesn't change. That does change the fact that, like, compared to something like Zenless, which by so many measures is very explicitly sexual, like it's not full, it's not to the point of some of the other bigger, longer known names that are very well known for being very, very lewd. But I think Zenless is sort of in the middle of, like, it's very PG. It's to the point of being PG-13, all of the stuff is inferred, that sort of thing. It's not explicitly lewd on its own, but people make a heck of a lot of lewd art of it. Versus, Uma Musume or something similar to it. I think there's a few out there that have similar rules, which wants you to still really be interested and engaged with the characters, but isn't specifically relying on that particular flavor of psychological manipulation. However, this all loops back into an interesting thing about Japan and Japan's laws and questionable legality, because gambling, generally speaking, is not allowed in Japan. They have much stricter rules even than the United States about gambling. And so a lot of gambling is very illegal. However, it's been illegal for a long time. And between both legitimate businesses and illegitimate ones, including a lot of things associated with organized crime, there are a lot of clever, I would hesitate to say, at least initially smart seeming but not particularly subtle workarounds to how people can gamble. And so I'm no expert on horse racing, but something tells me as well that the adjacency between horse racing and gambling, which is fairly explicit, and then the adjacency between horse girl game and a gacha system, and Japan in general and its relationship both to anime and sexuality and gambling. This is a weird bit of synthesis all tying it together, where you've got these different aspects that are all kind of questionable in the legal sense, but have become such important cultural exports, or at least visible cultural exports, that it makes it particularly fascinating to me. The Western game development side of things has really learned almost all of its tactics. Like, it initially, at least, learned all of its tactics about microtransactions basically from Japan and to a lesser extent China. It may have taken them further because both Japan and China have various laws around those things that are a little bit, well, I don't want to say they're more protective. They're different. The laws are different. And so, especially in the US, games that are targeted in the US, they exploit the rules to the furthest extent of the law. No surprise there. But it just gets me constantly thinking about what this means for the games industry, whether internationally or domestically, or what the rules are for what people can do with IP and what kind of fan material can be made, and the way that people are taken away from the ultimate goal, to my mind, which is gaming. And that gets into kind of the last thing about that I find interesting about Uma Musume, which is that compared to, well, it is also kind of a cross between various game types that are typically associated with the gacha genre. I'm calling gacha a genre because most of Uma Musume's gameplay, from what I've seen, I haven't played it, but I've watched a bit of it out of curiosity for this exact thing. Most of Uma Musume is not really a game. The arcs that you play through in the narrative are it appears on the surface to be a visual novel type game, but from what I've seen, most people after a little while, they just skip everything. They just skip all the dialogue. There's a dedicated skip button. No surprise there. That's not unique or anything, but because there's a lot of dialogue and it's, to be frank, not very well written. The characters are not that deep. Like, each of the characters in Uma Musume that I've seen can basically be distilled down to a couple of adjectives. There's, you know, the crazy one, there's the angry one, there's the tsundere one, those sorts of things. Those are the types of tropes that this thing is operating on. And so most people are just like, yeah, I get it. Just here, I need you to train in this way, in this way, in this way, and then you do a race. But the racing itself is like not really a game either. There's a bare minimum of interaction where you're not technically just watching a video play, but for the most part, you kind of might as well be. And so I'm looking at Uma Musume and I'm watching footage and I'm seeing how people tend to be playing it and thinking, so this has avoided some of the pitfalls I've talked about in the past of like sexual manipulation and those sorts of things, but has fallen into others that I think are far more severe on some level, where there's less gameplay to my mind in Uma Musume than there is in like Zenless Zone Zero. I don't know how good Zenless is. I've watched a good chunk of that as well as I was trying to like research about it at the time a year ago. I don't know if Zenless is a well-balanced game, but it at least seems to have mechanics. Uma Musume is a shallow, again, subjective here, is a shallow visual novel that people skip through so that they can, you know, try and get their horse girl to the end to try and, you know, grind out more resources for more drops. And of course, people have their favorite girl and they want to get the drops for, you know, the new outfits and stuff like that. But this all is back to my point of, are these games? Like, at what point does it kind of stop being a game? At what point do you say there's so little interaction with a thing that this entire thing is just a visual hook to get you to pay money to look at more pictures? At what point at what point do you like look at the blurring of the line between game and paying for images, where you might as well just, you know, go do a image search online instead? And again, far be it for me to judge what makes people happy. If you are genuinely fulfilled by games like Uma Musume, then more power to you. But I think about it both from a sense of like, is it ethical on an individual level to manipulate people who might be susceptible to direct manipulation into giving a game developer money? And on the larger scale, what does that mean for the games industry, and what is both acceptable and expected? And then what is the norm, you know? Do we lose definition or even the ability to make certain types of games because they become unmarketable? I've talked in the past how certain developers and certain publishers, some big US publishers, have really made big pushes to become like almost completely microtransaction dependent, because for various reasons it does tend to be a more sustainable income stream for them. But rarely if ever do they consider any kind of ethicality or anything other than their core profits, right? That's why they hire the psychologists. But I'm glad to see that while in the last year since I made that video about that stuff, we've both gotten a lot of new games that fall into this sort of category of various levels of psychological manipulation, but we've also gotten some real great narrative single player games that continue to come out. That's what gives me solace in these times when I often feel like my favorite, or one of my favorite art forms is being constantly diluted, to see that there are things like Clair Obscur, made by a couple of ex corpo, Ubisoft devs who decided to, go off and make their indie title and it becomes a massive hit. And even if that game isn't for me, and it isn't, like, I still love, like, I don't want to play it, but I think it's amazing. And I'm so glad it does super well, and that I get to keep feeling that this industry is not dying. It's not dead yet. Maybe it's dying. Maybe it's dying little by little, but the tools are still out there. People are still making things that I think appeal more to those who want to see narrative and art pushed. We're not done yet. Anyway, this might be my most rambly of these episodes so far, but I think a lot about the state of games. And I think considering these things is super important. If you love any of the games that I've mentioned, or hate them, or have any particular opinion, then of course, by making it to the end of this video, please let me know if you think I'm way off base, or if I'm exactly right, or somewhere in between. Polite discourse is always welcomed, but these are the things I figuratively, thankfully not literally, stay up at night thinking about, and hope keep getting better. Anyway, thank you for watching another episode of Solipsist Rambles, and I will see you guys next time.